Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very, very special. I have with me the author of The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper, Roland Allen, and we're going to be getting into the history of notebooks. And if you guys know anything about my other YouTube projects, and I have this thing called Park Notes, which is just way, way bigger than this, takes way less effort, but way more people want to know how I study and not necessarily what I study. But you guys are the faithful few, so I appreciate you. But you will know that I love notebooks. Notebooks sponsor my channels. I love them. I love leather covers for them. I love different styles. I love different styles of keeping them. And so this book is just a treasure trove of all of those. So if you're a notebook head, then you'll love this. But also, like, if you're a history buff, because as it turns out, paper and notebooks are pretty central to a lot of things in Western history, as well as Eastern stuff too. But so it's a history book and it's a notebook book. It's really good. So I want to get in and chop it up. Before I do, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen over on Patreon or right here on YouTube members. So if you guys like this podcast, if it's your top 5, top 10, if it's in there somewhere, consider supporting this channel, helping me justify doing this to my wife and my daughter, and helping me buy dog food for my dogs. That'd be great. And of course, helping me get more notebooks. All right, that's enough commodification here. Let's jump in with Roland Allen and let's talk about the history of thinking on paper, the notebook. Roland, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Oh, thanks, Parker. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, definitely. This book is so good. I am going to try not to just continue to praise you for writing this book. I want to get into some of the details. Can I just ask, as we start, like, why this book and why now? How did this project come about?
There are multiple answers to that question. I suppose when I work in book publishing, right, and when we talk about books, the big questions we ask ourselves before they come out is why now? Why this book now? And why should this person write that book? Okay, those are the big questions. And if you look at most books, you'll see that there's a timely element, or that they're trying to tell you that there's a timely element. And there really isn't a timely element to this. There's nothing particularly 2024 about notebooks because they've been around for so long. But I think I was the first person really to put enough effort into thinking about where they came from and considering them as an invention. I think notebooks, we see them everywhere all the time. Like, everyone who's listening to this podcast will have 3 probably within arm's reach, and whether or not they use them. And they're so ubiquitous, I think that they become a bit invisible, and that most people have never stopped to actually think, where is this interest? Where did this very interesting thing come from? Or even they don't even think of it as an interesting thing. So I guess that where this book came from is when I started thinking along those lines, which was about 6 or 7 years ago, which was after I'd been using notebooks in different ways for quite a long time. And then the immediate opportunity was that I lost my job in early 2019. Wow. And so I had a little bit of time and a little bit of money. So I started work on the book and then managed to find a publisher, and the rest is history.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm a big notebook head. I got a stack of unused terms.
There you go. Yeah.
They're all over the place. Yeah, I got it's probably a bad habit, but I especially love commonplace books. And so I've been tracking down the history of those, and through that, I've discovered different ways, compendiums and all sorts of stuff. But there was a bunch in your book that I hadn't even heard of before, and I want to talk about some of those. But I must ask, because I know my audience will want to know, did you manuscript this book, or like significant portions of this book, in a notebook, or did you betray us all and use a word processor?
Of course, I used a word processor to actually write the thing. Yeah. I did use a stack of notebooks when I was researching it. The big problem I had when I was researching this was that there was no existing story I could follow. I sort of had to make it. I had to uncover it as I went along. If you're writing a biography of Winston Churchill, it's been done before. You know what the beats are. You know where he was born, etc. Writing a biography as the notebook was much more complicated. I had to pull in strands from everywhere. And then notebooks themselves became really, really useful, obviously, because I could gather up my thoughts together on the page. I could make spidergrams and lists and draw arrows and circle things, which I thought were interesting, write down questions to myself, all that stuff. And that's, but what was really interesting was that I got better at that as the book proceeded, because I found out all of these interesting things about how to use notebooks. So my early notebooks actually weren't very good. And by the end, and certainly with the writing I do now, my notes are really organized, and I have lots more notebooks on the go at once, because I think that's quite key, actually, to have one notebook per project, which I learned from Virginia Woolf.
That's beautiful. So my other YouTube channel called Park Notes, I tell people that all the time. And I have special types of commonplace books for different projects, and it stays in there. So when I want to remember that, I go back in there and I thumb through and I find new things, but it's like, because it's so compartmentalized, I have the quotes that I need for that topic in there, plus my thoughts, because I manuscript out as well. And it's like the best tool. I wish every academic would do it, because it would save them a lot of time. And then when they passed on, we could see all their notes. Some philosophers have their commonplace books for us, but not very many.
I will say there's like nearly everyone these days, I write on a word processor when I'm doing the long form writing.
Yeah.
And that has one massive advantage, which is also a massive disadvantage. If you're writing on a word processor, when you start a sentence, you don't need to know how the sentence is going to finish.
That's right.
Yeah. Because you can stop halfway, go back, change the first word, add a clause, take away a clause, put a comma in. If you're writing by hand, if you try that, you'll get really badly stuck. You need to know what your sentence is before you start writing down the first word. And that I think is a really good discipline, that writing things out in longhand, as I do with my diary, is a totally different way of writing to typing, I think, because you just have to know where the sentence is going before you start it. So you have to think in advance, which is a good discipline.
Yeah, I caught C.S. Lewis writing something like that in one of his letters. He was writing to someone, and he talked about having a cadence when you're writing, and it doesn't make sense to us. Even like folks who were writing on typewriters were like, "Oh, I guess the cadence makes sense because it's a little bit different than today." But writing by hand, he said, like you look up after a sentence or two and you think, because exactly what you're saying, like they just had different ways of writing when you're writing everything by hand. Especially as you mentioned in here, that paper is expensive or it's coming down in price. If you're writing on papyrus, it's going to be different. If you're like, just the medium actually matters, and it'll change how you use it, which is super cool.
Completely, yeah.
With that note on paper, so the book is called The Notebook: A History of Thinking on Paper, and you start off by saying, "Here's a quick little before paper anecdote." It's super cool. I'm going to mispronounce everything in here, but the diptych, yeah,
Diptych.
that was so cool. Can you lay that off? What is that?
Yeah, so this has got a much longer history than the paper notebook that we know of. So this is the writing tablet which the ancient Romans used, but before the ancient Romans, the Greeks used it, and before them, people who we don't even know who they were used it. It has a very, very long history. The oldest one we have is 3,500 years old, and it wasn't a new thing, I'm sure, even then. So you're looking at a history of thousands and thousands of years, and until the paper notebook comes, people use these things, these little writing tablets, or diptychs, as you say, and they were made out of wood. So they were like little wood covers which would open, and on the inside you'd have a thin coating of beeswax, which might have been dyed. It was sometimes dyed yellow, and you could scratch into the soft beeswax with a stylus, and you could therefore take notes very easily in it. And then you could close the diptych covers, the pages, if you like, on top of it, and that would protect it so that you could put it back in your pocket, back in your bag, and carry on with your day. And people took all kinds of notes in these things. There are, for instance, at Pompeii, many paintings which have survived at Pompeii and Herculaneum, showing them in action. And really interestingly, they use them in different ways depending on whether they're picturing them with a man or a woman. If it's a man, it's a business thing. So they have quite big ones. I say they're diptychs, but often they are made with many pieces of wood, so they have multiple pages. So they become very chunky. They're almost like bricks. If they're women, they tend to be doing something creative with them. Often the muses, the inspirational muses, are depicted holding a tablet or a diptych and a stylus. There's a famous picture of what seems to be one of the muses holding a stylus sort of quite seductively up against her lips. So that's what they use. But there are big problems with the diptych, and great advantages, but problems too. One of them being that, of course, with your thumb, you can just wipe it clean at any point. So it's difficult to have a permanent record there. And the other thing is, if you're trying to do anything with business, then you need a permanent record which can't be changed, because otherwise you're leaving the door open for fraud later on. You can't do a contract when someone can walk away and just change it, to suit them when the other party isn't in the room. So the way they got around that, if they wanted to write something permanently, was they would take a fresh diptych, they would write the contract or the deal or the arrangement or the will in it. Then they would take a piece of string, wrap it around the diptych, and seal it with sealing wax, so you couldn't open it again. So you couldn't read what was in it. So they then had to put a papyrus label on the outside saying what was in the diptych, and then they would file it away. But it would be secure. But that was the only way you could get secure writing in the classical period. So one of the best diptychs we have comes from a shipwreck off the southern coast of Turkey, a place called Uluburun. And it comes from this fantastic shipwreck where the vessel was full of all kinds of crazy stuff, ingots of metal and ivory carvings, gold, silver, swords, coins. No one really knows where it came from, where it was going, but it was clearly plugged into this really complicated network of trading, because there's things there from Italy, things there from Northern Africa, from the Middle East, Cyprus. So, and the tablet on that boat was probably something to do with the business. It could have been a bill of lading. It could have been a list of goods of some other kind, or invoicing, or pay for the sailors. We don't know. The writing, unfortunately, is long gone. But we know that 3,500 years ago, when this poor boat went down, people were using these to administer their business and probably do other things like write poems as well.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love that part about the seal, because just the way you wrote it, it's in this logical form. So it invites this question, like, well, how would, what if they wanted to be confidential? And then you talk about the seal, or you talk about how sometimes they could bore a hole and lock it in other ways. And it's just like so innovative. And it's really cool, because this is all wrapped around ideas. It's just words like have to be conveyed to someone else in a trustworthy manner. And so what are we going to do?
Yeah.
And then from there we get paper from the East, from China, I believe.
Yeah.
But then, as you say in the book,
So,
they were the Europeans were resistant, and it all kind of met in the Middle East. So could you lay that out for us?
yeah, sure. So the Chinese invent paper actually at about the same time as the ancient Romans invent the book as we know it, in terms of a book with pages and a spine and hard covers, which we call
codex,
the codex.
Right?
That form is the codex. Yeah. So and in that context, they always have pages of parchment. So the Chinese invent paper around the year 200 AD, and it's really useful stuff. Interestingly, they don't really use it for writing too much. They use it much more for wrapping things, or for making posters, or for other practical things. But the Chinese are quite happy with writing on silk and bamboo mostly. But paper eventually becomes useful for people who write, and it moves west along what we historically call the Silk Roads. And at a battle in 751 called the Battle of Talas, this is mythically the moment when paper comes into the Islamic world, into the Middle East. So the Talas is by the Caspian Sea. It's near the Caspian Sea. And at that, according to the legend, at that battle, a few Chinese paper makers are taken prisoner by the soldiers of the Caliphate. Who knows? Might be true, might not.
Sure.
But we do know that by about the year 800, so not long after that, they're making paper in Baghdad. And at that point, that's where they seem to have combined the Western style codex, this book with a spine and covers and pages, and made paper versions of it. And that, I think, is the birth of the notebook. Now, the problem is that the records are really difficult for me as a non-Arabic speaker to work my way through. And also, speaking to the experts, there just don't seem to be any surviving notebooks from that period. There's lots of surviving manuscripts, but they're sort of worked up and complete. And I think a notebook is a working document which is sort of necessarily a bit scrappy and a bit unfinished.
Mhm.
But anyway, 800 in the Arabic world, you've got, or Muslim world, I should say, you've got notebooks. Then they percolate all the way around. At this point, Spain is Muslim, and very quickly, or comparatively quickly, they're making paper in Spain, and they make really good paper there, because the two things you need to make really high quality paper are fresh, really fresh running water, lots of fresh running water, which obviously is hard to find in the Middle East, from mountains ideally, so it's nice and clean, and lots of flax as well, because the best paper in those days you make from linen, and linen comes from flax. So there's a place called Hattiver. Hattiver in 1244 gets conquered by King James of Aragon and Catalonia. And that's the point where paper comes into the Christian world. And you're right, there is some resistance to it, and that comes from the church. And it seems to be a mixture of things. Firstly, there's just this fear of what's new. That's traditional in churches. They've got on very well with parchment for 1,000 years. Their identity, remember, is very much tied up with Bibles, and the Bibles that they have, and the prayer books, and the missals, and the Psalms are all going to be on parchment. They're all going to be, or many of them, hundreds of years old. So you can see why there would be an emotional attachment to parchment. They then also view it as being a sort of a heathen material, because it comes from the Islamic world, and also, which is a fair point actually, because paper is made from undergarments by and large, linen undergarments, which are then recycled into paper. They think that they're necessarily unclean, that it's an unclean material, which is kind of a fair point. But as you are making paper out of old undergarments, you mash it up and clean it and bleach it. So in practice, that never seems to be a problem. But that's sort of visceral disgust.
Don't they also?
Some people off.
Don't they also? I caught somewhere in there that they're soaking parchment in human urine, and they're also soaking paper in human urine. So, like, even in that process.
Well, yeah, human urine was a great source of uric acid. So it's fresh, it's reliable. You can always find a source. It's cheap. So it's a major industrial thing, and uric acid is quite useful in lots of ways. So they used it to soften wool in the filling process. That would be soaking wool in vats of human urine, and animal skins when they're making parchment, same deal. And again with the flax and linen fibers when they're preparing them for the for pulping. Wild. So yeah, there's lots of pee around.
Yeah, that's wild. So on top, so there's the linen undergarments, and then there's the soaking in pee and all that together, and we get this fresh paper that smells amazing when you open up a new notebook. Maybe ours is a little bit different, right? But yeah, back in the day.
Yeah, a little bit different. So paper was really thick in those days. But so it's much more like, if you get really upscale letter writing paper today, where you can really see the chain lines in it, or cotton rag paper. Sometimes you see in art galleries and museums for artists to use. So it's really thick and fat, but the principle of it is exactly the same as modern paper otherwise.
Yeah, that's amazing. So yeah, it makes sense that the church would be resistant to it. There's also, the whole like Latin thing, and how that was the whole, I'm a Protestant Christian myself, so I'm like on the side of let's print everything, get it all out there. But there's on top of that, there's theological wars and political wars going on, and paper comes in at the center of that, which is really fascinating. This is why I love this, because you can look at history through so many different lenses, and you look at history through one of my favorites, which is a notebook itself, which is so cool. With that though, if I read the book right, then it seems like notebooks really, once they got cobbled together and actually made into an actual item, they exploded because of merchants in Venice, right? Venetian merchants.
Yeah. So Venetian merchants, but the very first generation probably in Florence, actually. Oh, yeah. But yeah, northern Italy was the hotbed. So you think about those amazing northern Italian cities, not just Florence, but Padua and Genoa and Venice, which became really rich. They were the richest places in Europe at the time. And it's not because they've got huge farmlands or massive natural resources, quite the reverse. They don't have any well, Venice has colonies, but the others don't. It's because they're just really good at managing money. They're really, really good at managing money. It's as if they've invented the Excel spreadsheet, and they use this basically to trade incredibly profitably with the rest of Europe. And the rest of Europe sort of sees this as a kind of, not quite witchcraft, but it's definitely sort of Italian ways of doing business are really respected and seen as being very mysterious and amazingly good ways of making money, which other people just don't understand. So, and they're doing this with double entry bookkeeping, which gets invented around the year 1300, probably around Florence. And double entry, I don't know if any of your listeners are trained bookkeepers or accountants, but I invite them to punch the air here, because they're the real heroes of history. And they're under-recognized, because it's those people who really nail down profit and loss, things like balance sheets. The company comes from this time as a concept. Before then, you have no companies. There are limited liability partnerships, time-limited partnerships. There's futures trading. There's depreciation. All of this stuff comes from this period, and all of it depends on notebooks to work the money on, to work the numbers with.
I love that. And you, I think you were saying that your wife was in accounting school at the time.
Yeah, she was training for bookkeeping, and it suddenly struck me while I was researching. She was studying at the time, and all of these metaphors in bookkeeping, like bookkeeping itself. You open the books, you examine the books, you cook the books. The profit margin, of course, comes from the margin on the page. All of these metaphors go all the way back to the very earliest days of accountancy and the invention of accountancy as a profession. And I think that's a kind of beautiful heritage. Still ties it, even though it's all digital now.
Yeah, seriously, you can't escape that language, because that's how it started. I love that. In that same era, I think that's, and I'm going to butcher this. I've been trying to say it because I don't want to like give it a real Italian pronunciation, but it probably has one. But it's like the zibaldone.
Parker, I'm going to give you some advice. Right, imagine you're in an Italian restaurant and you're trying desperately to fit in with the locals, and so you just charge at it. Zibaldone.
Yeah. Okay.
Go on.
I am Italian, so my ancestors probably like rolling in their grave. You know, my last name is
Zibaldone.
It's Setacase, but the real Italian is Setacase. So it's like, all right. So
it's beautiful. We'll just do it
zibaldone.
in that way.
Yeah,
exactly.
Zibaldone.
Perfect.
Okay.
So zibaldone, and it actually, restaurants is a good setting for it, because it seems to have meant salad. Actually, that's the derivation of it. And like a salad, a zibaldone was a notebook where you just filled it with tasty stuff. Anything you wanted to keep hold of and read later. Now, remember, you mentioned print. This is 200 years before printing arrives. So not many people have got complete books in their house. If they've got a complete manuscript copy of a book, that's expensive and unusual. But in Florence, what they do is they take the business notebooks home, and they just start filling them with poems, Aesop's fables, stories from Ovid, their favorite stories from the Bible, their favorite prayers, public announcement, recipes, weird cures for diseases, anything like this, anything which they think is going to be useful or fun. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. They just write down whatever they want to keep hold of. And I just love them. They doodle in them as well. They illustrate their own stories as well. And what you get is this real love of reading. And Florence at the time was super literate. Like, nearly everyone could read and write, unlike nearly all of Europe. And they really enjoyed it. They took a huge amount of pleasure in reading poetry and stories and keeping them and passing them around and sharing them. And I think this is something which we can all learn a bit from. I think everyone should have a zibaldone, definitely.
Amen to that. I had such a longing for these people. I was like, man, the whole city, like everyone had one, and they would pass them to each other, and they'd write in each other's, and they would share their favorite quotes with each other. And I'm like, that to me is so much more beautiful than just being like, well, let's talk about the weather. Let's talk about, the sports game. Like, let's talk about, like, no, here, let me share you. This is a beautiful saying. Write this down in your zibaldone. Like,
yeah, proverbs were very common. Exactly. Yeah.
This.
So, and I just love the fact that it's fun. It's just fun.
Yes, totally. And it's a fun hobby that makes you literate, that makes you well-read, that makes you someone who can give a proverb and a wise saying because it's on your tongue, because you just read it in your book like a second ago.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, it helps you remember what it was that you read.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's another important point. It's actually like writing it down by hand and like transcribing it helps it get up in here and stay in there. Um, on my other YouTube channel exploded. It's almost 200,000 subscribers, and that's all because I make a lot of videos about commonplace books, and YouTube loves commonplace books. But most people in the popular level think a commonplace book is a zibaldone, and they're like, yeah, it's a
Yes,
commonplace for all
exactly.
your ideas. And it's like, well, not
Yeah.
actually. I don't want to be Mr. like technical or whatever, but these are historical artifacts that people have used forever. And a
Yeah.
commonplace book is they have common places. So it's like here's a
Yeah.
title, and that's how I find the quotations if I'm going to go write a paper, if I'm going to go give a speech. They're under common places, and that word has become commonplace. That's like, oh, it's
Hmm.
so obvious, but it was like a special moniker that you'd put quotes under. So can you because I you write about commonplace books in here as well. Can you give us a characterization? Does that make sense to you, or what would you add to the
Yeah.
distinction between a zibaldone and a commonplace book?
That's the distinction is really important, and that you're right, it's just got completely lost over time. And that was one of the really fun moments when I was coming back over the history, was to sort of discover that loads of books which are described as being commonplace books aren't.
Mhm.
And that this is the commonplacing is a kind of, if you like, it's kind of software which you apply to the hardware of the notebook. Yeah.
Mm.
So as you say, what you do is it depends what you're interested in. Typically commonplace books were kept by students or schoolboys, and they might be studying quite serious things. So the headings they would be interested in would be things like justice or vengeance or tyranny. So what you'd do is you'd stick a headword like that, like tyranny, at the top of a page, and every time you came upon something in your reading which was relevant to that topic, you would just find the most interesting bit, the useful quotation, the bit which sums it up, or the most, the pittiest, the most poetic part, the best definition, and you just write it down along with where it came from. So it might have come from the Bible, it might have come from um, a history book, it might have come from, again, Aesop's fables or anything like that, and or the classics. And so you would build up over time on the page which was headed tyranny, a little mini encyclopedia about the topic.
Mm.
And after a few years of doing this with every book you read, which was what you had to do at grammar school, and sorting out all the topics very, very carefully, you would end up with this quite large notebook, which is absolutely packed with useful wisdom or thought provoking stuff. You didn't have to agree with it, you just had to find it interesting. And this kind of encyclopedic juxtaposition of ideas, but in quite an organized way. It's hard work to do, but it's so rewarding, I think. And for hundreds of years, this is like the backbone of a serious European education, or rather the
Yeah.
humanities education. So we have lots and lots of them that survive. Some of the most fascinating, we have people like Milton's. So we know exactly what the young John Milton read on his way through to writing Paradise Lost, etc. We know that that whole generation of playwrights around Shakespeare, Johnson, Marlowe, they definitely would have kept quite extensive commonplace books when they were at school, at grammar school. So we know when we look at a Shakespeare play and say, okay, this plot comes from Holinshead, and this comes from Ovid, and this image comes from another place, Marshall. We know that he probably collected all of those influences as a young man. He probably had them in a bank,
Mm-hmm.
which he could then refer to for his entire writing life. And the same goes actually for many of the people who are watching him, of course. So that you have this amazingly sophisticated audience, as well as sophisticated playwrights putting stuff on the stage for them. So commonplace books are just amazing. Everything suggests that they were really hard work to make and
Mm-hmm.
keep, and no fun. There are quite a few commonplace books which are broken off at the halfway stage, or not even then. But also everything suggests that if you persevere with them, then they become incredibly useful.
Yeah. Well, that's so beautiful, and that's I I didn't know about commonplace books until I'd already been keeping them for 6 years through my own studies
Mm,
because I wanted to remember them. I wanted to have
mm,
quotes while I was doing public speaking, all sorts of stuff like that. And then I discovered it through a theology degree and finding out that Melanchthon, Luther's like understudy, called his work
Yeah.
Loci Communes, and it's probably the wrong.
Yeah.
Totally used the term wrong, but the term's been bastardized throughout history the whole time, which is wild.
Yeah.
Ah, yeah.
Well, that generation, so he would have been one of the very first, because it was actually Luther's great rival Erasmus who popularized the idea of the commonplace book. I think also, if you're looking at the history of print, it's a reaction to the sudden number of books in print in that period. So you're talking about the
Mm.
early 1500s, and it's when print is completely exploding. And it's the first time, I think, in European history where there are more books around than you could possibly read.
Mm.
Right? Like right up to about, well, certainly up until Gutenberg, you could read all of the books. You know, you might have trouble getting hold of them, but you had enough time, you know, in your life to read all of the books that survived.
Mm.
100 years later, that's not the case. Everyone's overwhelmed by the sheer number of books and the amount of stuff that there is to read. So then you have to start organizing your knowledge and discriminating.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. So I love that history. The word starts with Aristotle because he's looking for commonplaces for like argumentation, and then the Roman rhetoricians get a hold of it and are like, no, let's add some quotations, and then Boethius is like, no, we have to be true to Aristotle, and all the way through, and the quotation folks won, which is great. But so then keeping a zibaldone in distinction to that it is fun. It's just like, hey, here's a quote that I love, here's a recipe that I like, everything goes in here. I keep something called a catch-all. It's a pocket notebook, and
Nice.
I also put to-do lists in here and stuff like that. And so I would think that this would not be a zibaldone because I have like actionable tasks that I need to do as well. So I started a new one
Yeah.
that just like quotes and some of my favorite ideas. I know it's like maybe overly technical, but I am a philosopher. I like to get clear on this stuff.
No. Yeah, be clear on it. I think that there's a definite value. I really enjoy old shopping lists and old things to do lists.
Mm.
You know, coming across a things to do list from 10 years ago, 20 years ago in an old diary is just, I find that very satisfying. You know,
Okay.
I mean, don't ask me why, but it takes you back there. It's immediate. And when you write, do you write a diary as well or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I find a really interesting exercise is to go back to like this day 20 years ago and see what you're doing. And even if it was just a very short snippet of, oh, I talked to Dan about such and such, you'll suddenly find that the whole conversation comes back to you.
Mm.
You can relive it. Memory is such a funny thing. These little prompts can really make things come alive.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm in the process of writing a book on how to do philosophy, but I'm doing it through notebooking, through using notebooks. And so your book is really fantastic for that, for helping with that research. But part of it is that's philosophy started with examining your life. And today we've lost it as philosophers. And so I went through a whole master's degree in philosophy, and there was no like examine your life and here's how you can do it. And it's like that's fine, but I thought the unexamined life was not worth living. And so like, yes, keeping a
Yeah.
diary, even if it's a philosophical diary, or keeping a journal, what's the difference between a journal and diary? Well, here you go. Let's talk about that. Here's a philosophical
Yeah.
commonplace book, and just, you know, keeping record of your life. Just like you said, you can remember what's going on and reflect on where you've been, where you're going, gain wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And learn from your own experience that much more, I think is why we do it, isn't it? Or one of the reasons why we do it.
Well, so that brings me to Michael of, I'm going to say Rhodes. It's probably not right.
Yeah.
Is it Rhodes?
That's right.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Well, he's got this. Yeah, he's like this beautiful character. I found myself almost crying, like reading this part of the book. This was the most impactful. I was in the coffee shop and I'm like, I love this guy. I love him. And his life is kind of tragic, but it's also beautiful. And he has like wins and losses, and it's really, that alone would be worth getting the book, which is really beautiful. Can you, like, how do we know anything about this guy? Can you help with that?
Yeah, just give you a glimpse behind the curtain. That chapter, which I think must be like 4,000 words long now, so a chunky chapter of the book. I had to take that down from about 20,000 words. I could have written a full book about Michael of Rhodes, and I loved him. And what's interesting is I spoke to 3 or 4 of the people who. So Michael of Rhodes was a Venetian sailor in the year 1400 or so, and he left behind his own personal notebook. And this was only rediscovered really about 15 years ago. And it was studied very, very thoroughly, because it's very complicated, which we'll come to, by a team of American and Italian academics. And I spoke to a bunch of them, and they'd put years of their life into this project, really deep, deep historical, primary source research. And they all loved Michael. They were absolutely devoted to him. They just thought he was the best. And none of them thought he was perfect, but they just loved his sort of spirit. So, who was Michael? Why was he called Michael of Rhodes when he was Venetian? Because he seems to have come from Rhodes, which was the Greek island hundreds of miles away from Venice. Venice was one of the richest cities in the world at this time. It had really strong trading links all across the Mediterranean. It wasn't a surprise that a young kid from a small Greek island would end up in Venice. What is surprising is that he started out pulling an oar on a trading galley as a young man, as a boy, and gets himself promoted and promoted and promoted. So by the end of his career, 40, 50 years later, he is actually commanding a whole fleet in the Venetian Navy, going to war against the Turks. He sails as far as London and Bruges in the north, all over the Mediterranean multiple times. He has the most fantastic, he fights in battles, he gets shipwrecked. He has the most fantastically interesting life, and he writes it all down in this zibaldone, or in this notebook. But he also writes down everything else that interested him. And really what interested him, it turns out, on this massive adventuring kind of swashbuckling life, was mathematics, maths puzzles. He was absolutely obsessed by them. So there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of maths puzzles when he writes down, like, okay, if I pay so much for a barrel of pepper in Alexandria, and then I swap it for 3 bottles of olive oil in Venice, and then I trade that for 14 goat skins in Marseille, how much profit have I made? These kinds of arithmetic puzzles. But he was also interested in maths for its own sake, and algebra. So there's tons of algebra in this notebook. Algebra in his day-to-day life was completely pointless.
Right.
He was rowing in a trireme, or he was telling other people how to row on a trireme. He's fascinated by astrology. There's lots of astrology in the book. He's got these kind of portal land maps, which are kind of route maps, kind of Google Map style turn-by-turn instructions, if you like, for sailors for getting around all of the Mediterranean and all the way up the Atlantic coast and North Sea to the English Channel ports, for instance. So, and this notebook is just packed with stuff, and it's this crazy insight into this very well-lived life. And right in the middle of it, he has his resume, year by year, his CV, and it looks exactly like yours would. From this year, I was working here, he was my boss. Next year, I was working there, he was my boss. And of course, they're all naval appointments in the Navy, but it still gives you this amazing sense of he really cared about his life, his career. He wanted to better himself all the time, and he was just relentless about it. So that's interesting. And of course, because he was a medieval man or medieval person, he had just completely taken as read, if you like, Christian faith, which comes through all the way through the book. At the top of every page, nearly, he puts a small cross just to show that he's always writing under the sign of the cross. There's a picture of St. Christopher, which he copies out from a statue somewhere in Venice, which is really cute, when clearly he's touched this picture. For him, it has sacred powers. All of this sort of stuff. So he really comes to life. And he was quite a character, Michael of Rhodes, even though he never actually sits down and says, I'm like this. You can just tell he was intellectually curious. He was ambitious. He's probably a bit violent. But ultimately he dies in poverty in Venice, living off a tiny, tiny pension. And he doesn't leave very much to the church, but what he has, he leaves to the church.
Yeah. And I believe he married 3 times, and his wives kept dying, and his children as well. Was that him?
That sounds right. It might have been twice.
Okay.
It's a little unclear. He's a bit ambiguous, because I think when he refers to his wife, he never makes clear which wife it is, but certainly 2, I think. I can't remember the detail. And he seems to have had a son and a daughter who died as well.
Yeah.
It's possible that in the records, his oldest daughter might also be his wife, if you see what I mean. It's hard to know who he's referring to when he says her name. But yeah, and the family life is interesting. He barely touches on it. You know, he says, "Oh, on this voyage, my son died."
Yeah.
That's it, and it must have been heartbreaking.
Seriously. Yeah, I picked that up in a few different styles of notebooks, and record keeping where people they're just writing the fact. Here's the fact.
Hmm.
And as the historian looking into it, you're like, you know, that just like ripped their heart out. But it's not their
Yeah,
diary. They're not like, and here's how it made me feel. It's just
no,
today, I'm keeping a record so I can remember. And it's like, wow, man, this guy's life is all over the place, ups and downs. And he had this glass ceiling because he's not from there, and so he couldn't get appointed to certain positions because only the locals could, and you see his frustration, and his whole life is
yeah,
there.
and you know he thinks he's smarter than these guys,
He
and he
probably
knows
is,
he's
right?
smarter than
Like,
these
yeah,
guys.
he's
Yeah, this
abstract.
very human resentment.
Yeah, just amazing. What would you call that kind of notebook? What was he keeping? What is that thing?
It's hard. It's like nothing else. It's
Yeah.
really hard to say. You either call it a notebook or a book. I think
Mhm.
he called it his book. At the front of it, he actually wrote, and I
Oh,
think
that's
this is
right.
very charming as well. You know, like a school kid, he wrote, "This is the book of Michael of
That's right.
Rhodes,"
That's right.
and and it's. I think it's fair to respect his wishes in that he didn't call it a zibaldone. He could have. You know, they were around at the time, but he chose not to. So, uh, just the book of Michael of Rhodes.
Yeah. So I definitely recommend people grab this book because we're not doing it justice here. Even like you may be tearing up at home or whatever, but it's a beautiful story that you get to see. Plus, there's other ones which I want to talk about too in a remaining time, like Adrian Conan's
Kunin.
Kunin, Adrian Kunan's Visbook.
Oh, that looks difficult, but it's easy. It's Fishbook.
Yeah,
You
yeah, yeah.
pronounce it Fishbook, and it is a fish book.
Oh, you do pronounce
So,
it Fishbook.
um,
Okay.
uh,
Okay.
yeah, it's fish. Um, Dutch is nice that way. It looks completely different, but it sounds a lot like English.
Mm.
So, Adrian Kunin was he was a fish merchant. He lived in Holland, and this was a couple of 100 years later, and he lived in a town called Scheveningen, which is outside The Hague now. And it's a beautiful seaside town. It's got a huge beach. And on this beach, they used to land their fishing boats. And the Dutch coast was one of the best places to particularly fish for herring. Herring, which became like almost an industrial commodity actually at the time, because what they would do is they'd send out their herring fishing boats called fishing buses, which were quite large, and they would just stuff them to the gills with herring, which you could catch in enormous quantities, and they would salt them and pickle them at sea to keep them fresh, and then go back ashore with these barrels of herring, which would then be traded all the way across Europe and sort of eaten in Russia. So that's the origin of the herring trade. But Adrian Kunin, he was fascinated not just by herring, but also by everything that lived in the sea, whether it was mermaids or octopuses or flatfish or squid, whales, anything like that. He was fascinated by it. And in the fish book, he makes his own personal kind of encyclopedia. So it is a bit like a commonplace book because it's quite well organized. But he fills it with pictures as well. So he's always drawing things. And to be honest, he's not an amazing artist, but you get the idea, you know. When he's got a dogfish, you know it's a dogfish, even if it's not a brilliant picture. And in this sort of homemade encyclopedia, he describes, you know, where you catch this fish, where you find it, what oceans, seas it comes from, whether or not it's good to eat, any stories about it, any myths, any legends about it. But he's quite indiscriminate as well. So if he hears a story from a sailor about mermaids in the Baltic, you know, he'll write that down as you know, sort of as not fact, at least as reported. You know,
Yeah.
so the book's full of crazy myths and legends as well as real fish. And he's a great character, and he then later in life makes a bit of a living from just showing this book at fairs. He'll put the book in a tent and charge people a few pennies to come and have a look at it because it's so amazing and just full of all the fish.
Yeah. I love this one. I've been keeping my own. I call it a nature log, and so I go out. I really like herpetology. I really like frogs and turtles, and so I'll go out to ponds and rivers, and I bring my notebook with me, and I try to draw. I'm a terrible drawer as well,
Mm,
illustrator, but I make my own. I'm trying to get better at it, and then I
yeah,
record a little bit about my day, what happened there, what was it like seeing them, things like that. And now I have this cool log of my nature
that's amazing.
adventures.
That's fantastic. Yeah, as one of the since the book has come out, interesting things keep happening. It's so nice. Um, I've been contacted by a group based in San Francisco of people who do exactly that. It's
Mm,
nature journal keepers, and they have a conference next year, which they've asked me to speak at. Which
yeah,
is, I had no idea that there was this community of
yeah,
people who did it. You know, I wrote about a few in the book. Darwin, of course, is
mhm.
like the nature journalist extraordinaire. And apropos, Darwin could not draw, so don't worry about that. You
That's
know,
good.
he did fine.
Hey, change the world. Yeah.
um, yeah, but uh, the idea that there are organisations out there of people who do this stuff and get together and share their stuff is wonderful.
Yeah, it really is, and it's part of the part of the beauty of it. When you start doing it, sometimes you just do it on your own, and then you find a group of people, and you're like, "You do this too? Holy cow!" And you join this group. Other times, it's like, "Yeah, I'm intentionally becoming a part of this community, and this is what we do. This is what it means to be part of this community." And then you get to share and
Mm,
say, "Look, I found, in Illinois, I found a Blanding's turtle, and Blanding's turtles are endangered species. There's almost none of them, so that was a huge deal for me to find a Blanding's turtle. That's
amazing
crazy.
moment.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So I want to wreck that. Like,
yeah,
what happened? What were the conditions like? But how did it make me feel
yeah.
as well? So it gets me all excited talking about that stuff. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. And all of naturalism, basically, as we not naturalism, botany and
Hmm.
uh, zoology came around from people like you doing that hundreds of years ago, and then gradually bringing it together and synthesizing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an amazing thing to do. Hats off.
Thanks. So something that was new to me that I don't know if I fully understand yet. I kind of do, I think, but it's the album amicorum or the
Yeah,
Stammbucher.
yeah, the album. Yeah. So your guy Melanchthon, he had one definitely.
Mhm.
Um, so this is it actually starts around the time of Luther and Melanchthon
Mm,
and in that kind of environment. So imagine you're a student at the University of Wittenberg or Erfurt or one of the German universities at this time. You're probably studying theology or law, and the big stars at this point are the big preachers. So you've got Luther, Melanchthon, people like that, and your professors as well would also be stars. And someone hit upon the idea, some German student hit upon the idea of an autograph book.
mhm,
But it's like an autograph book plus, yeah? Because you don't just get the autograph, you get a little motto, a little dedication, often a biblical verse. And your professor writes in it and says, Parker, here is a biblical verse for you to inspire you. You are my friend. I will always think of you fondly, Professor such and such,
mm,
Melanchthon. And then you would take it to the next one, and then you would travel to study at another university. You could knock on someone's door and say, look, I know Melanchthon.
mhm,
And of course you're building up your social network this way, and of course you would sign in return, and whoever you met would sign it. So you would build up this little autograph book. But it was, like I say, I think an autograph book is almost a way of saying you don't know someone, that you
right.
saw them once,
Yeah.
but your acquaintanceship started and stopped with a scribble. Whereas this is the reverse. This actually shows that you know them. So imagine if we were having this conversation in person, we would definitely be getting out our album amicorum
Yeah.
and swapping them and doing a little dedication to each other and saying how nice it was to meet and how our friendship will last forever. And of course, what we will do instead is these days friend each other on LinkedIn or Facebook or Insta or whatever your channel of choice is. Um, but anyway, so the Germans took this rather seriously, as they were early Protestant Germans, so they were very, very serious people. But over the border in Holland, shortly afterwards, the Dutch pick it up. They're a bit more fun-loving. They love. They also love intellectual pursuits. They love the arts, in particular um, the drama and paintings. Great generation of Dutch artists, including Rembrandt, and they become obsessed by Album Amicorum, and they start drawing in them.
Mm,
So, because a lot of these people have learned drawing as part of their curriculum, um, some of them are just beautiful. Some of them are terrific. And what's interesting is that the artists aren't known people anymore. They're just doing sketches of memento mori or topics like that. But they're really fun. And again, they build up. I think as a notebook fills up and builds up and fills with various things, it becomes really a fascinating object nearly all the time. And the Dutch become obsessed by this, and it becomes a real social climbing thing. And it's how you measure your status, is the state of your album amicorum. So it becomes a bit less serious than the Germans, but a bit more fun. And this is a fascinating thing. I don't think this made it into the book, but it was such a common thing in Holland that thousands of these things survive to this day because they became family heirlooms naturally. So this is grandfather's, and then he'd pass it down. So the national collections have got, I think it's 800, but there are still plenty out there in the wild, which are just being held by the descendants of the people who made them. And I was talking to this curator, a really nice guy called Jeroen, who said, "Oh, it breaks my heart. People will come in and they'll show you this amazing album amicorum. It's 500 years old. It's the most amazing, incredible, beautiful thing. It's full of historical reference." And you say to them, "Are you looking after it?" They say, yeah, we get it out every Christmas." Have a look, pass it around the table. So it breaks the curator's heart. But these are amazing things. And what's really odd, the Dutch do it, the Germans do it a bit. Weirdly, the Hungarians also pick it up. No one else ever does it. The Dutch get mocked for doing it by the English.
The English mock them. That part cracked me up. Yeah, like I don't. That's what I don't really get. So in the States we have yearbooks. And I don't know how the UK is, but after you, are you familiar with the yearbook? Do you know what that is?
It's interesting. They've come in. We've picked it up from you. We've picked up yearbooks and proms. We never used to have those. Okay. So my daughter's now 21, and when she left, when she left school at 16, she had a yearbook and a prom. And in my generation, we didn't have either of those things.
Yeah. Well, so we always get together at the last day of school and we sign the yearbook, and we
that's a nice thing.
Yeah. Have a great summer. Or we just, if you're quick, you just go HAGAS, and everyone, sometimes the funny one, the class clown would write something funny and stuff. And so we have those. And so I'm like, that's kind of like the album, amicorum, amicorum. But so I kind of get that, but I don't understand why the English would be like, you guys are silly. That's like for kids. And then it ends up becoming for young girls. It becomes like their friend book kind of thing, right?
Well, I think I don't know how many British people you know, but we just mock foreigners relentlessly. It's sort of part of what we do. And back in those days, it was worse than ever, or worse than it is now even. So I think we just saw it as something foreign, and because it was foreign, it was automatically laughable.
Okay.
Like good food, for instance, or opera. There were plenty of people laughing at that.
Okay. That's pretty funny. And I guess it makes sense that Germans and the Dutch are similar in their mentalities and stuff. Maybe don't say that to them. They might be upset by that, but even their languages are pretty similar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I've traveled quite a lot in Germany and Holland. There are a lot of similarities when you're dealing with them, doing business with them. With the Dutch people, you can sort of see they are super gregarious. They really are sociable. They value that very highly, I think.
Okay.
And that sort of relationship being sealed officially with a handshake and kind of, we're friends now, is quite something which endures.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we're running out of time here. There's also a really beautiful, thought-provoking chapter on Leonardo and can you say his name? The Pacioli?
Pacioli. Luca Pacioli.
There we go. Luca Pacioli. And their friendship and their like relationship, and there's all sorts of beautiful stuff. I think many people will know about Leonardo's notebooks because there's facsimiles out there and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. But I didn't write this down in the notes that I gave you for the questions, but maybe you have it on the top of your head. Pacioli's Dang it, his Summa. In his Summa, he gives 4 different types of notebooks. The Memoral. Do you have those on the top of your head? Could you help us with those?
Okay, yeah, I'll tell the story. Yeah, okay. So this is good. This is a nice sort of question to pull us into the final straight, because it goes right back to what we spoke about at the beginning, the bookkeeping,
Mhm.
right? And so the Italians learn bookkeeping at school. They have these special schools called abaco schools, where you learn your ABCs and you learn the arithmetic of business. So it's like as if when you went to elementary school, one of your classes was basic business,
Mm.
and that's how they get so good at it. And eventually, this is in sort of the early years of print, so it's after hundreds of years of the Italians being really good at bookkeeping and accountancy. This monk called Luca Pacioli writes down everything anyone knows about maths and arithmetic, including all of this business stuff, in order to make the big book of maths. And then he goes to Venice and he has it printed. And it's actually a really serious endeavor. It's a massive publication, and it was a huge print run, and it sold out. He was a bit of a star. He could give public lectures on geometry, and he would pack out the venue. So Pacioli was a bit of a sort of, he was like I wouldn't call him a Malcolm Gladwell type figure, but he was like a public intellectual. Yeah. And one of the people who read his book was Leonardo, who was around at the same time, a little bit younger. And he doesn't care about the bookkeeping or trade at all. His mind is entirely on other things. He loves the geometry, though. So he says, well, Luca, if you're ever in town, give me a call. And they meet up, they strike up some kind of friendship. They both probably were gay. I personally don't think that they had an ongoing sexual relationship with each other.
Mm-hmm.
But they spent about 3 or 4 years kind of in this intellectual partnership, because basically Leonardo makes his living going from court to court, going from Milan to Florence to France, being flashily clever. Yeah, being a brilliant painter, but also just having amazing ideas, putting on plays, he dressed in nothing but pink and purple. He was a complete show off, utterly flash.
Yeah.
And he'd show off his drawings and his ideas and his diagrams, and it was a lot of it was show. And these notebooks seem to have been, when he did, for instance, those famous drawings of tanks or flying machines, they seem to have been his way of just showing off how clever he was. I don't think he ever intended any of them to be built. And so he's this kind of court intellectual, and Pacioli fits into that role quite well in a totally different way, because he was very sober, very serious, not flash at all. And then they hang out for, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think about 10 years, going from place to place. And it's quite turbulent at this time. There are wars. France invades Milan, and they have to move, and so on. But the thing about Leonardo is he couldn't concentrate on anything for too long. He was terrible at finishing things. So the Mona Lisa is unfinished. Yeah, he was working on it for about 20 years. He started painting a teenager, and when he died, the poor woman was middle-aged and still hadn't got her portrait. So he wasn't very good at finishing things, which meant he was terrible at publishing. So he never published a book in his lifetime. And no one really knew what was going on in his notebooks until the year 1895, when they were first published, first transcribed and properly published. Pacioli, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He would happily go to the printers. He spent a year probably just in the print shop, making sure that his books came out right. Mm-hmm. So he was very focused. He was, had that meticulous quality, which Leonardo was just too fast moving for. But yeah, they had a really, really clearly productive friendship. And I'd love to have been on their conversations. They must have been absolutely amazing.
Seriously, and wide ranging, because they had a short little book of like chess moves, and then like a book of puzzles, and just the stuff to keep them occupied. But it's like, this is brilliant stuff in itself.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see these incredibly clever guys stuck up in a mountain castle for a winter. They must have been bored out of their trees, so they come up with chess puzzles between them.
Yeah.
That's a really nice. I'd forgotten the chess puzzles. Yeah.
Well, so Pacioli has he recommends his students keep a day book, a journal, a general ledger, and then a waste book.
Yeah.
Do you know what was
So
is a waste
these
book
were
a
the
scrap?
four.
Yeah, scrapbook.
No, the waste book is like the first draft, and
Okay.
this is a usage which carries on for 100 years or so. So when for instance you out making your botanical notes, you might do a really scrappy version, and then go back home,
Mm,
sit at your desk, and write a neater version, and
yes.
cut out the rubbish, and just have the important bits, and have full sentences and punctuation. And that's so the waste book is just the jottings, and then you would have these other notebooks which were clearer. And that's what you need if you want to run a business. He says a minimum of 4 notebooks, and of course everyone wants to run a business like an Italian in those days, so they immediately rush out and get loads of notebooks, and then people find, which is the story all the way through history, people find other uses for this incredibly useful little thing.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful, and there's many, many, many more stories in this notebook. Roland, thanks so much for writing this. Thanks for doing the work. This I try to read at least 52 books a year, and so far this is my favorite book of the year out of all the books I've read. So this has
Oh,
been
Parker,
beautiful.
that's so kind of you to say. Thank you very, very much. I've really enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, if someone wanted to find out more of your stuff, hear from you more, something like that, where might they go to find more from you?
uh, I have www.roland-allen.com, and I have Insta, which is at notebook_historian. Look for Notebook Historian. To be honest, there's not as much there as I'd like. Actually, I'm going to give a shout out to a really amazing Substack, which is run by someone I know. And if you like notebooks, you ought to look at this.
Mhm.
And it's called Noted, and it's
Noted.
written by an academic called Gillian Hess, which is Jillian Hess, Hess. Noted. It's fantastic, and she has an amazing scope of notebooks, and because it's online, she can just illustrate it relentlessly, which I couldn't really do in the book. And yeah, if you like notebooks, go and look up Noted on Substack. You'll love it.
Fantastic. Awesome. All right, folks. Well, that's going to have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées. And as always, all glory to God.